5 years have passed, but I still have a vivid recollection of the moment I found out about Logan. My hometown will never forget it either. I was sitting in my senior year history class when I got the news. Meanwhile, my mother was grocery shopping and my best friend Callie was out having breakfast with her boyfriend at a nearby diner, having skipped class. She was the one who heard it first. Although phones were not allowed in the classroom, at the time teachers had not figured out all of the ways that students could sneak them in. I had been hiding my phone between my history book and my desk, texting, during the entirety of second period, and I was irritated. Logan had been picking me up for school every morning since we began dating nearly 2 years ago, and today he had failed to do so. Logan was always prompt, but it was unusual for him to not show up without warning. He rarely skipped class, and when he was even a minute late, he would get anxious. I didn't think too much of it at first, since he could sometimes be a bit absent-minded. I assumed he had to attend a doctor's appointment or a meeting for student council, and had simply forgotten to tell me. However, not only had he not showed up, he hadn't even texted me. Although he still hadn't texted me back, my annoyance was growing with each passing moment. I kept sending more and more messages, one after the other, while I vented to Callie. I said that if he couldn't even remember to pick me up, then it was clear that he didn't love me. Reflecting on it now, I deeply regret my actions. I was really getting into my tirade, my fingers pressing against the phone screen as I vented, when I suddenly received a text that put a stop to it. Callie had just found out from the diner news report. Logan was no longer alive. I can still recall the thoughts and emotions that swirled through me in the moments leading up to sending that text, but I have very little recollection of how I felt afterwards. This lack of memory continues to trouble me. I heard that I caused quite a stir during Mr. Tiller's lecture on the War of 1812. Jenny Carlton, who was sitting in front of me, was so startled by my sudden outburst that she almost fell out of her chair. Embarrassed, and without a second thought, I got up and left the room, leaving my books, backpack, and even my phone behind on my desk. It's been 5 years since it happened, but people still talk about it all the time. To many, it has become more of a legend than a memory. This is likely due to the fact that it happened on Halloween, and it was such an odd occurrence that it was easy to transform it into an eerie story. In the years to come, it's possible that people won't even remember that Logan was a real person. The campfire's flames flickered and swayed, casting eerie shadows on the faces of the gathered crowd. With hushed whispers and pregnant pauses, they began to tell the story of the boy who was found dead in his basement on Halloween. The boy was the latest victim of Trudy Rutger's axe. It was a story that would be told for years to come. It all began as a tale, so it was only fitting that he was part of it. Unfortunately, his demise will now be ingrained in legend. It is heartbreaking that this is how he will be remembered. Logan was the epitome of an all-around great guy. Not only was he the class vice president, but he was also the most talented pitcher our high school baseball team had ever seen. Logan had big dreams of making it to the major leagues one day. He was a gentleman from the start. On our first date, he presented me with a bouquet of flowers and kept up the tradition every Friday by bringing me coffee and a donut. In addition to his school commitments, he also volunteered at an animal shelter, baked cookies with his grandma, and even helped his teammates with their math homework. His bright blonde hair always seemed to stick up a bit in the back, despite his attempts to tame it. His hearty laughter was accompanied by a little snort that only added to his charm. The person I cared for deeply, Logan, has been reduced to nothing more than a small part of an absurd horror story. It is disheartening to see him being utilized as a tool to make fictitious stories appear to be real. The story of Trudy Rutger has been a part of folklore for generations. It began as an eerie tale told to my parents, or perhaps even their parents. Despite having a few elements of realism, it was a fictitious story with fabricated names. There were no actual victims associated with the story. My next-door neighbor used to say that, on the night before Halloween, you could summon Trudy Rutger. My uncle also said that Trudy had killed her own baby. Even though there wasn't a written version or source to the story, most of the details remained the same regardless of who told it, making them seem like an indisputable truth. Many years ago, Trudy married a local lawyer named Thomas Rutger. They settled in a large house on East Main Street. Unfortunately, the house was demolished and replaced with a strip mall and a coffee shop. Local people have heard stories that strange things occur around Halloween at the coffee shop. Logan was captivated by the place and its stories. In Thomas and Trudy's time, Their house was one of the finest in town, making Thomas a desirable husband for many potential suitors. Even after the couple had married and welcomed their first child into the world, Thomas did not remain faithful to his wife, and Trudy eventually discovered his indiscretions. On October 31st of one fateful year, Trudy reached her breaking point. She walked in on Thomas with another woman, and in a fit of rage, she used an axe to take both of their lives. Devastated by the violence of her actions, she then hung herself. The fate of their baby remains a mystery. It had been a year since Thomas and Trudy's double murder-suicide rocked the small town, and though the scandal had died down, the memory was still fresh. On the anniversary of the tragedy, a local woman was walking down the street when something peculiar caught her eye. The woman couldn't believe her eyes when she saw Thomas Rutger, alive and standing in front of the dress shop that had once been his law office. She called out his name, but he didn't respond. He seemed to be in a trance, staring at the building with an empty expression. She stepped closer to him and hesitantly tapped him on the shoulder. He jumped at the contact and finally turned to face her. But instead of a reaction, the recognition she was hoping for, she got nothing. He seemed to have not seen her, as if he looked right through her. Not uttering a single word, he abruptly turned and walked away. That evening, the woman was discovered deceased in her backyard. It was discovered that she had been killed with an axe. Every Halloween, on the anniversary of their deaths, Trudy and her victims return. Although they look like regular people, they act differently. They won't respond to anyone and don't seem to be aware of their surroundings. They are never seen with anyone and remain eerily quiet. This is exactly how it should be, for they no longer exist in this world. There is a barrier between life and death that is said to be unbreakable, at least until Halloween comes around. On this night, it is believed that physical contact can cross this barrier. If one touches Trudy or any of her victims, which is rumored to be around a dozen now, and they look you in the eye, it is said you will be cursed with the same fate. The story of Trudy and Thomas is one of those eerie tales that has been passed down through generations, similar to the legends of Bloody Mary or the Slender Man. Although this story is often used to spook children, there is no concrete evidence that it is true. It is unlikely that such characters ever existed in this town, or even existed at all. This is simply an urban legend with no basis in reality. Logan was discovered in his basement with an axe lodged in his chest. Even now, it feels strange to speak of his death in such a direct manner. It seems disrespectful, almost as if to bring up his death in such a frank fashion somehow lessens the impact of his life. The tragedy of the case was that he was found dead with an axe in his chest, and there was absolutely no evidence pointing to anyone or any reason for the murder. All potential leads were followed up on, but nothing came of them, and the investigation quickly turned cold. As far as I'm aware, the case has not been revisited since. That is her. I was abruptly brought back to the present by a loud whisper coming from the stage. Even though the whisper was intended for someone else, I was certain that the two young girls, probably around 13 or 14, were talking about me. Since I had arrived at the coffee shop, I noticed that they had been stealing glances in my direction. I kept my gaze fixed on my coffee, trying to avoid looking at the couple sitting across the table. It was clear that the girl belonged to the guy. I knew they had to be together. They had the same kind of aura that only two people in love could have. After Logan's passing, the rest of senior year was a daze, and I moved away for college shortly after graduation. I've returned home a handful of times since then, for Christmas or a summer holiday. I'd thought the pain would ease eventually. I'd hoped I would be able to walk past the football field without recalling Logan's grand gesture of using the marching band to ask me to prom. I wanted to be able to go to the grocery store without automatically reaching for the generic brand of cola Logan's favorite. Every time I went home, it became more and more difficult. I could remember every detail of my time there, but my memories of my loved one were growing more distant. Instead of making things easier, the passing of time only made things worse. As a result, I stopped coming back. I had stayed away for 5 years, but 2 months ago, I finally moved back home for good. At first, it was difficult to cope with being surrounded by memories of my lost loved one, Logan. But with time, I began to find it easier. It wasn't an instantaneous process, but gradually I was able to start the grieving process. I stayed away from certain places that I used to love. Instead of the usual route to work, I took the longer route to avoid passing his house. The bench in the park, a spot that had been special to me, was now forbidden, as it was where we shared our first kiss. I could still go to his favorite coffee shop, the one at the site of Trudy Rutger's old house. He had a particular spot he enjoyed, right by the window in the corner. He had his reasons for picking this spot, the perfect vantage point for watching the people on the sidewalk, but away from the draft of the opening door, away from the counter noise, but at a great angle to smell the freshly ground coffee. As I sat here, I couldn't help but feel that this was the perfect spot. It made me think of Logan, of course, and the positive memories we had shared here. I remembered how he'd always get the baristas to add whipped cream to anything he ordered, even iced tea once. It made me smile, seeing the pumpkin scones he loved so much and how he'd buy 3 of them each time in case they sold out. I didn't allow myself to dwell on the tragedy of losing him until the 2 girls walked in. It was Halloween, and conversation about the murder was abundant. After being away for 4 Octobers, it was a struggle to be back on the anniversary of the victim's death. The news had run a special about the latest on the case, but I'd turned it off after 2 minutes, as there weren't any new details, just a recap of the gruesome facts. The high school had organized a fundraiser in the victim's honor. The warnings were everywhere, from the terrified kids at my niece's birthday party to the whispers of the 2 older men I passed earlier that day. Don't touch Trudy Rutger and her victims, or you could end up like Logan. Logan's presence was always palpable in this town, but today he was particularly memorable for everyone. I tried not to pay attention to the glances of pity and hushed whispers that followed me around all day, but I could only take so much. I grabbed my coffee with a dollop of whipped cream and a pumpkin scone, in memory of Logan, and buttoned up my coat. I didn't want to make eye contact with the 2 girls, so I left the building as quickly as possible. No more pity was needed. When I spotted him standing just outside the coffee shop, I couldn't believe my eyes. He was standing right in front of my favorite window seat, and it almost seemed like he was looking at the empty seat with a hint of sorrow. As the wind blew, a tuft of blonde hair lifted, and I knew I wasn't seeing things. He was really there, and this wasn't a figment of my imagination, brought on by the distress of the day. It was Logan, and he was genuine. I shouted his name, but the gusts of wind drowned out my voice. Undeterred, I sprinted towards him, wrapping my arms around his frame and feeling his solidity beneath my embrace. In that moment, I was reminded of a cardinal rule of Halloween in my hometown. Never let go of your friends. Under no circumstances should you interact with anyone who has been victimized by Trudy Rutgers.